You'd think living in an HOA community means safety and respect. But when Karen from the HOA decided she had the right to cut my lock and steal my Jeep, she had no idea she wasn't just messing with a neighbor. She was interfering with a vehicle owned by a federal police task force. And what followed, well, let's just say it turned the entire HOA upside down. Karen had always been a familiar face in the neighborhood, not because she was friendly or approachable, but because she was impossible to ignore. Her presence lingered like a shadow across the HOA community, always watching, always ready to insert herself where she thought she was needed. At first, her behavior seemed like the typical nosiness you'd expect from a homeowner who simply had too much time on her hands. But it didn't take long for everyone to realize that her concern was just a thin disguise for control. She appointed herself as the unofficial guardian of every yard, every parked car, every barking dog, and every late-night gathering, even though she held no actual authority beyond her spot as a vocal member of the HOA board. Her obsession wasn't just a quirk. It was a force that grew stronger every day, feeding on her desire to control every detail of the neighborhood's daily life. Started small, almost laughable. She'd send out snippy emails about lawn heights, leaving subtle threats about fines that she wasn't technically in a position to enforce. She'd take pictures of trash bins left out an hour too long, forwarding them to the board as though she had uncovered some criminal activity. Her neighbors whispered about her, rolled their eyes behind her back, but she thrived on it. Every look of annoyance, every muttered complaint only seemed to fuel her determination to tighten her grip on the community. It wasn't long before Karen became a name everyone knew, and not in a good way. The mention of her name alone carried weight, a mixture of irritation and fear. Over time, her obsession stretched far beyond rules and appearances. She began showing up at meetings with binders full of evidence against her neighbors, photographs of parked cars, notes about delivery trucks, and even detailed logs of who visited whom and when. It was clear she wasn't just monitoring the community. She was stalking it. Karen seemed to believe that the HOA was her personal kingdom, and the residents were her subjects. If you questioned her or pushed back, she'd make you a target. She had a way of twisting minor inconveniences into violations, turning the simplest things into battles she insisted on winning. What made it worse was her knack for convincing a few others to back her up. She'd charm them with promises of protecting property values and keeping the neighborhood safe. Some believed her. Most just kept their heads down, hoping to avoid being noticed. But Karen didn't need a crowd. She only needed her persistence and her sharp tongue. And with those, she could make anyone's life miserable. She thrived on the power she thought she had, and soon, she wasn't satisfied with just reporting what she saw. She wanted to take action herself. That's when things turned dangerous. Karen began to interpret the HOA's vague rules in her own way, taking it upon herself to enforce them even when no one else agreed. She started showing up unannounced on people's property, claiming she had the right to inspect for compliance. She'd confront delivery drivers about where they parked, demand explanations from guests she didn't recognize, and even move other people's trash bins without permission. It was no longer about community standards, it was about control, pure and simple. Neighbors grew increasingly frustrated, but few dared to stand up to her. Those who did found themselves the subject of endless complaints. A misplaced garden gnome suddenly became a violation of aesthetic standards. A child's bicycle left near the porch was labeled a safety hazard. Karen seemed to have a limitless imagination when it came to finding faults. She documented everything, building her case files like a prosecutor preparing for trial. And she wasn't shy about reminding people that she knew exactly what was happening in their homes and yards. The constant surveillance left many uneasy, feeling like they were living under the watch of someone who saw herself as judge, jury, and executioner. The tension only deepened when she began to fixate on vehicles. She declared that certain cars ruined the look of the neighborhood and demanded they be moved. She complained about guests who parked for more than an hour. She claimed that work trucks violated community standards, even when the HOA had no official rule against them. It became clear to everyone that Karen wasn't just nitpicking anymore. She was building towards something bigger, something more invasive. Her obsession with the vehicles in the community, including mine, was just the next step in her escalating campaign to control every corner of our lives. Behind her smug smiles and sharp remarks, there was an unsettling determination. Karen didn't just want compliance. She wanted obedience. And while most people just rolled their eyes and tried to ignore her antics, I had a sinking feeling that it was only a matter of time before she crossed a line that no one could ignore. She wasn't satisfied with her imagined authority anymore. She wanted proof that she was untouchable, and the lengths she would go to for that proof would soon shock everyone. The morning I discovered my Jeep missing started off like any other, but something felt wrong before I even stepped outside. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, expecting to see my Jeep right where I had left it the night before. Parked neatly in the driveway with the lock I always used to secure the gate shining under the early sun. But when my eyes landed on the empty space where it should have been, my stomach dropped. The lock that had been fastened to the gate was gone, the chain left dangling as though someone had cut through it with no hesitation. For a moment, I thought I was seeing things, that maybe I had parked somewhere else without remembering. But the sight of that severed chain told me everything I needed to know. My Jeep wasn't missing by accident. Someone had taken it. At first, my mind scrambled for the most logical explanations. Maybe it had been towed? Maybe there was some mistake with the HOA? Or some miscommunication about parking rules. But the longer I stared at the empty spot, the more those excuses fell apart. I knew exactly where I had left it, and I knew I hadn't violated a single rule. My Jeep wasn't just any vehicle. It was specially equipped and designated for federal use, a detail I kept quiet from most of my neighbors for obvious reasons. Seeing it gone didn't just feel like an inconvenience. It felt like a violation on a level I couldn't put into words. As I walked closer, I noticed marks on the ground where the tires had been, faint impressions leading away from the driveway. The cut chain told me the thief hadn't even tried to be discreet. Whoever had taken my Jeep hadn't cared about being caught. They had wanted it badly enough to risk everything. And that's when suspicion started to creep in. This wasn't the work of a random stranger off the street. The neighborhood was gated, and getting in without permission wasn't easy. Someone from inside had to be involved. The realization settled in my chest like a stone, and one name surfaced instantly: Karen. It wasn't just a hunch. For weeks, she had been watching my Jeep with a kind of interest that went far beyond her usual nosiness. She had made comments about how military-style vehicles don't belong in a residential neighborhood, and had even hinted that it was unsafe for children to see such a rugged-looking car parked on the street. I had brushed it off at the time, thinking it was just her usual complaining. But now those remarks echoed in my head with a new, chilling clarity. Karen had always seen the Jeep as something she didn't approve of, and in her mind, not approving was reason enough to take action. I felt my pulse quicken as I pulled out my phone and called the authorities, reporting the theft. But even as I spoke to the dispatcher, I couldn't shake the thought of Karen standing smugly in her living room, watching me through the curtains, convinced she had finally taken control of the one thing that had been out of her reach. The dispatcher assured me they would send someone to investigate, but I knew this was more than just a case of a stolen vehicle. It was personal, and it was about to explode into something far bigger than Karen could ever handle. While waiting, I paced the driveway, replaying every interaction I'd had with her over the last few weeks. She had recently mentioned that some people think rules don't apply to them. Her eyes fixed squarely on me as she said it. At the time, I had let it slide, but now it felt like a warning I had ignored. The missing Jeep wasn't just about the vehicle. It was about Karen proving that she could do whatever she wanted, no matter how outrageous or illegal. As neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by the sight of me standing in the driveway with obvious frustration, I noticed the whispers start. A few glanced toward Karen's house, and I could see blinds shift ever so slightly, as though someone inside was trying to watch without being noticed. The entire street seemed to know something had happened, but no one was saying a word. Their silence only fueled my anger. They had all seen what Karen was capable of, and yet no one dared to confront her. I knew the Jeep's disappearance wasn't just going to affect me. Karen had crossed a line that would bring in forces she couldn't possibly manipulate or intimidate. She thought she was just removing something she didn't like from her precious neighborhood. But in reality, she had stolen government property tied directly to a federal task force. And while she might have thought of this as a neighborhood dispute, the consequences of her actions were going to reach far beyond the HOA. When the HOA finally responded to the report about my missing Jeep, I expected at least a shred of seriousness, maybe even concern that a crime had occurred right under their watch. Instead, what I got was a flimsy excuse that almost made me laugh from the sheer audacity of it. The board claimed that Karen had acted within her rights as an HOA member to remove a potential safety hazard from the community. They framed it as if my Jeep wasn't a vehicle but some kind of threat lurking in the driveway, ready to harm the pristine image of the neighborhood. The words they used were careful, polished, and designed to sound official, but it was clear they were nothing more than a shield to protect Karen from facing the consequences of what she had done. The more I listened, the more the excuse unraveled into absurdity. According to the HOA, Karen believed the Jeep was abandoned and that its presence posed a danger to the property values of nearby homes. That was the phrase they repeated over and over again: property values. As if the sight of my Jeep, clean, locked, and well-maintained, was somehow capable of dragging down the worth of every home in the community. They insisted that Karen had not stolen the vehicle but had merely relocated it to a secure location until the matter could be resolved. The way they twisted the language was almost impressive in its boldness. To them, cutting a lock and driving away in a vehicle that wasn't hers wasn't theft. It was community service. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if the board had chosen to live in an alternate reality where Karen's word was law and anyone who challenged her was automatically in the wrong. They spoke about her like she was some kind of guardian angel, protecting the neighborhood from the chaos of an unapproved Jeep in a driveway. When I pushed back, reminding them that the vehicle was not only mine but also tied directly to federal operations, their tone shifted from defensive to dismissive. They told me I was escalating the situation unnecessarily, and that if I had an issue, I should have attended the last HOA meeting to voice my concerns. The sheer nerve of suggesting that this was somehow my fault nearly left me speechless. It was clear that Karen had already gotten to them. She had probably marched into their office with her binders, her photos, and her exaggerated claims, spinning a story about how the Jeep was a risk to the safety and aesthetics of the neighborhood. And like always, they had folded under her pressure, too afraid of her wrath or too blind to see how far she had gone. The HOA board wasn't just covering for her. They were enabling her, feeding into her obsession and allowing her to cross lines that no reasonable person should ever cross. What stung the most was the utter lack of accountability. Instead of admitting that Karen had acted recklessly and illegally, they shifted the blame onto me. They questioned why I had a vehicle like that in the neighborhood, implying that I had brought this on myself. They didn't want to hear about the cut lock, the missing vehicle, or the fact that Karen had essentially committed a felony. All they cared about was smoothing things over, pretending nothing serious had happened so the HOA could maintain its carefully polished image. As I sat there listening to their excuses, I realized this wasn't about rules or safety at all. This was about power. Karen had positioned herself as the voice of authority in the neighborhood, and the board had chosen to back her rather than admit the truth. They would rather bend reality to fit her narrative than admit they had lost control of one of their own. And in doing so, they had revealed just how deep Karen's influence ran. Neighbors who had once complained quietly about her were now silent, watching from the sidelines as the board parroted her excuses. Some probably believed the story, while others simply didn't want to get dragged into the fight. But I could see it in their eyes. The unease, the recognition that if Karen could cut a lock and take a Jeep without consequences, there was nothing she couldn't do next. The flimsy excuse from the HOA wasn't just an insult to me. It was a warning to everyone else that Karen had the power to get away with anything she wanted. The board wrapped up the conversation by suggesting that I work with Karen directly to resolve the issue, as though I were supposed to sit down and negotiate with the very person who had violated my property and my trust. They acted like this was just a minor misunderstanding between neighbors, something that could be smoothed over with a polite chat. But I knew better. Karen didn't make mistakes. She made moves, calculated and deliberate, and the HOA had just proven that they would let her get away with all of them. When the federal authorities got involved, The entire tone of the situation shifted in a way that no one in the neighborhood had expected. Up until then, the HOA and Karen had treated the missing Jeep as a petty community dispute, a trivial matter that could be swept under the rug with a few carefully chosen words and some blame shifting. But the moment federal agents arrived and began asking questions, the flimsy facade the HOA had built around Karen's actions began to crumble. The sight of government-issued vehicles pulling up to the community gates was enough to draw the attention of nearly every resident, and suddenly the whispers that had been circulating turned into an anxious silence. People peered out of windows, curtains shifting ever so slightly as they realized this wasn't just another neighborhood spat. It was serious. The agents didn't waste time. They asked pointed questions, moving with a confidence that left no room for argument. They wanted to know when the Jeep was last seen, who had access to the property, and whether anyone had witnessed unusual activity. I could see the HOA board members struggling to keep their composure as they stumbled through their answers, their rehearsed excuses falling flat under the weight of official scrutiny. For the first time, Karen wasn't the loudest voice in the room. She sat stiffly in her chair when the agents requested her presence, her usual smirk replaced by a forced calm that barely concealed her nerves. It was almost surreal watching her try to spin her story for them. She claimed she had acted out of concern, that she believed the Jeep was suspicious and didn't belong in the neighborhood. She insisted she had taken action to protect the community, her words dripping with the same false righteousness she had used to bully the rest of us for years. But the agents weren't buying it. They pressed her for details. How exactly had she managed to move a locked vehicle? Where had she taken it? And under what authority did she believe she had the right to do so? Each question left her stammering just a little more, her polished veneer cracking under the weight of the truth. The more she talked, the worse it got for her. She tried to shift the blame onto the HOA, claiming they had supported her decision, but that only dragged the board further into the mess. The agents took notes, their faces unreadable as they listened, and I could tell they weren't fooled by her act. They had heard every excuse imaginable, and Karen's attempt to paint herself as a hero was falling apart quickly. For once, she wasn't in control. She was cornered, and she knew it. As the investigation unfolded, the reality of what she had done became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a case of neighborly overreach, it was a federal offense. The Jeep wasn't just my personal property. It was tied to sensitive operations, and tampering with it had far-reaching consequences that Karen clearly hadn't considered. The agents made it clear that this wasn't going to be handled quietly. There were protocols, and those protocols didn't leave room for HOA politics or Karen's self-righteous narratives. The ripple effect was immediate. Neighbors who had once avoided confronting her now watched from a distance with a mix of shock and relief. Some looked almost satisfied, as though they had been waiting for this moment, for Karen to finally face the consequences she had managed to avoid for so long. Others looked nervous, worried about how far this would go and what it would mean for the community as a whole. But no one dared to speak up in her defense. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with an iron grip of intimidation now looked small under the gaze of federal scrutiny. The HOA board tried desperately to salvage their own image, insisting they had no knowledge of Karen's actions and that she had acted independently. But the agents weren't interested in their attempts to distance themselves. They wanted facts, evidence, and accountability. The board's carefully rehearsed lines about community safety and protecting property values crumbled in the face of the undeniable reality. Karen had cut a lock, taken a government vehicle, and jeopardized something far bigger than the neighborhood's tidy appearance. For me, there was a strange sense of vindication in watching it all play out. After weeks of feeling like I was the only one willing to stand up against Karen's obsessive control, seeing her face consequences was almost surreal. But alongside that vindication came a deep anger. She hadn't just crossed a line, she had obliterated it. And while the agents kept their professional composure, I could tell by the way they exchanged glances that they understood the gravity of what had happened. This wasn't something that could be swept away with a fine or a stern warning. Karen had opened a door that could not be closed. Karen's attempt to cover up her crime was almost as reckless as the act itself, and watching her scramble to rewrite the narrative was like watching someone build a house of cards during a storm. The moment the federal authorities made it clear they weren't going to let the issue slide, she switched from defensive to manipulative, pulling every trick she had used on the HOA board for years. She tried to paint herself as the victim, claiming she had been pressured by vague community concerns, and that she had only acted to prevent something bad from happening. She leaned on the same lines she had used so many times before, words like safety, values, and protection. But for the first time, they rang hollow. No one was buying the act, though Karen was too stubborn to see that. She began spreading rumors almost immediately, whispering to anyone who would listen that the Jeep had been illegally modified and dangerous. She claimed she had received anonymous complaints from neighbors who were too afraid to come forward, insisting she had only been doing what the community wanted but didn't dare ask for themselves. It was classic Karen, using invisible supporters to justify her actions, turning her neighbors into nameless allies who couldn't be questioned because they didn't actually exist. She told anyone within earshot that she hadn't stolen the Jeep, she had secured it, twisting the language to make it sound like she had done a favor rather than committed a felony. But her cover-up didn't stop at gossip. She took it a step further, producing fabricated evidence that she claimed supported her decision. She printed out photos of the Jeep parked in my driveway, labeling them with phrases like abandoned vehicle and neighborhood risk. She pointed to the lock I had placed on the gate as proof that I was hiding something from the community. To someone who didn't know better, it might have looked convincing. But to anyone who did, it was clear she had gone from controlling to desperate, spinning a story that was falling apart with every new detail she invented. She even tried to manipulate the HOA board into backing her once again. At the next meeting, she stood in front of everyone with her binder, rattling off her accusations with the confidence of someone who believed she could talk her way out of anything. She claimed that I had been intimidating her, that my Jeep was connected to activities that put the neighborhood in danger, and that she had acted as a last resort when no one else would step up. The board looked uneasy, clearly torn between their loyalty to Karen and the undeniable reality that she had gone too far. Some shifted in their seats, their eyes avoiding hers as she tried to rally them to her side. But the presence of federal scrutiny hung over the room like a storm cloud, making it harder for them to blindly nod along the way they once had. Despite her efforts, the cracks in her story were obvious. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak against her began murmuring to each other, questioning how far she would go to protect herself. Some quietly admitted that they had never filed complaints about my Jeep, directly contradicting the claims Karen was spreading. The more she tried to control the narrative, the more it slipped from her grasp. Her confidence, once so unshakable, now looked like arrogance teetering on the edge of collapse. Behind closed doors, she made attempts to intimidate me directly. She cornered me in the street one evening, her smile tight and her voice low, insisting that I should drop the matter before it got worse for everyone. She tried to frame it as a warning, as if she was still the one holding the power. But the fear in her eyes told a different story. She was scared. Scared of the truth coming out, scared of losing the control she had clung to for so long, and most of all, scared of the consequences she knew she couldn't escape this time. Her desperation only deepened when the agents started asking more detailed questions. She backtracked on earlier statements, contradicting herself in ways that were impossible to ignore. One day she claimed she had taken the Jeep to protect the neighborhood, and the next she insisted she had no idea where it had gone, as though someone else had been involved. Each lie piled on top of the last until even the people who had once defended her were shaking their heads. Karen had built her entire reputation on being the enforcer of rules, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood, and now that image was collapsing under the weight of her own deceit. What she didn't understand was that this wasn't just another HOA squabble. She wasn't facing frustrated neighbors or a board that could be swayed with enough persistence. She was facing federal investigators who saw right through her games. And the more she tried to cover her tracks, the deeper the hole she dug for herself. The fallout from Karen's actions was nothing short of explosive, and it spread through the community like wildfire. Word of what she had done didn't stay contained to the meeting rooms or whispered conversations. It became the central focus of the neighborhood, something no one could avoid talking about. The once quiet, polished streets of the HOA were suddenly charged with tension, and everywhere you turned, people were choosing sides, though most weren't brave enough to say where they stood out loud. The curtain twitchers and quiet complainers were suddenly watching openly, curious to see how the drama would unfold now that federal authorities were involved. For years, Karen had operated as though she were untouchable, and now the cracks in her armor were showing for everyone to see. Neighbors who had once been silent victims of her constant surveillance and harassment found their voices. Some began sharing their own stories, recounting times when Karen had stepped far beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Tales of her trespassing into yards without permission, threatening fines that didn't exist, and bullying people into compliance began to circulate. It was as though her theft of the Jeep had given everyone else permission to finally admit just how miserable she had made their lives. The community, which she had controlled through fear and intimidation, was no longer willing to play along with her self-imposed reign. The HOA board wasn't spared from the backlash either. Their flimsy defense of Karen had shattered their credibility, and homeowners were demanding answers. They wanted to know how someone could commit such a blatant act and still have the board's support. At emergency meetings, angry voices filled the room, and accusations flew back and forth. Some residents insisted the board had been complicit from the beginning, too afraid of Karen to hold her accountable, while others demanded resignations. The board members sat pale and defensive, trying to distance themselves from the scandal, but it was too late. Their willingness to let Karen run unchecked had brought the entire HOA into disrepute, and the community wasn't going to forget it. Karen herself tried to keep her composure, but it was clear she was unraveling under the weight of the consequences. The smug confidence she once wore like armor was gone, replaced by sharp defensiveness and flashes of anger whenever someone questioned her. She stopped appearing at neighborhood events, no longer the center of attention she had always demanded to be. Instead, she stayed hidden, blinds drawn tight, her presence now more a source of ridicule and resentment than authority. Neighbors who used to avoid her now spoke about her openly, mocking the very control she had clung to for so long. Her reputation had collapsed, and the fear she once inspired had turned into contempt. The federal involvement only amplified the fallout. Their investigation brought in a level of scrutiny the neighborhood had never experienced. Agents questioned residents, reviewed security footage, and left no stone unturned. People who had never cared much about Karen's antics were now directly involved, forced to give statements or provide any information they had. The community that had once been tightly wound around her control was now being dissected piece by piece, its secrets dragged into the light. And the more that came out, the more people realized just how deeply Karen had overstepped. For many, the turning point came when the agents confirmed that the Jeep wasn't just any vehicle. It was tied to a federal task force. That revelation sent a shockwave through the neighborhood. Suddenly, this wasn't about HOA rules or petty disputes over appearances. This was about a crime that had national implications. Karen hadn't just meddled in something trivial. She had put herself and the entire community under a spotlight they couldn't escape. Neighbors who had once shrugged off her behavior now looked at her with genuine fear, realizing that her reckless need for control had dragged them all into something dangerous. The HOA's carefully cultivated image of being a safe, orderly community was shattered. The local news caught wind of the story, reporters showing up outside the gates, hungry for details about the HOA member who had stolen a federal vehicle. Cameras captured residents coming and going, some ducking their heads, others seizing the opportunity to vent their frustrations on record. What had once been a neighborhood obsessed with maintaining appearances was now exposed to public humiliation, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. Behind the scenes, the pressure on Karen intensified. Rumors swirled about possible charges, about the federal government taking action that would leave her with consequences far beyond anything the HOA could have imagined. Some neighbors speculated about prison time. Others whispered about fines so steep they could ruin her. The uncertainty only added to the chaos, with everyone waiting to see how far the fallout would go, and what it would mean for the community they had once believed was untouchable. The silence that had once protected Karen was gone. People who had feared retaliation were now emboldened, and the truth about her reign over the neighborhood poured out in ways that couldn't be ignored. She had lost the control she had fought so hard to keep, and the entire HOA was left reeling in the aftermath of her choices. The fallout was no longer just about a stolen Jeep. It was about the collapse of an entire system that had allowed one woman to hold power she never should have had. 13.